Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome once more to the Edge Hill Festival of Ideas. Festival of Ideas is designed to celebrate our world-leading research here at Edge Hill, and we're looking at a range of different events over this coming week. But tonight, we are looking specifically at the untold animal stories of COVID-19. This is hosted jointly by Edge Hill's Centre for Human Animal Studies and the Institute for Social Responsibility. This special event will delve into the COVID-19 narrative and uncover the stories that haven't been told by the mainstream media. While initially other countries' cultural and food practices, specifically around wet markets and wildlife trading, were viewed as antecedent to the virus, industrial animal agriculture was also implicated. Leading organisations questioned human incursions into wildlife habits and our escalating exploitation of nature and animals. In the broader context of climate change, COVID-19 was portrayed, initially at least, as marking a turning point in human history, a moment where we needed to rethink our relationship with animals. But as the virus migrated from distant locations to our front door, the story of COVID-19 shifted. Questions about our relationship with animals faded, whilst efforts to contain and manage the spread of the virus and the debates around that took precedent. So tonight, our panel will ask, how and why did this happen? And then, with your help, the audience, we will then bring that into a discussion format to see if we can find some solutions. So who are our panel? First, we have Dr. Paula Arcari. Paula is a Leverhulme Early Careers Research Fellow within the Centre of Human Animal Studies at Edge Hill. Her 3-year project, The Visual Consumption of Animals, Challenging Persistent Binaries, aims to support transformational change in the way in which humans conceive and interact with nature. Donnell Gardine is a qualified veterinary nurse who has worked in the veterinary industry for over 2 decades. She is currently completing a PhD at Edge Hill University, researching veganism and the UK veterinary profession. And Dr. Alex Lockwood is a senior lecturer at the University of Sunderland. His research interests include forms of creative and critical writing that engage with questions of relationships across human and non-human boundaries. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to our first speaker this evening, Dr. Paula Arcari. Over to you, Paula.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Joe, and thank you to the Institute for Social Responsibility for inviting the Centre for Human Animal Studies at Edge Hill to convene this panel. As the panel title indicates, the untold story of COVID I offer today puts animals, or rather our relationships with them, at the centre, because the extent to which we can transform the way we relate to other animals will determine our success in preventing future pandemics, addressing climate change, and stopping the global biodiversity collapse. COVID's emergence underscored the convergence of these human-induced crises, and yet the immunisation of human lives against the effects of the virus has remained the prime, if not the only concern. Dominant narratives involving animals have revolved around 3 key questions: how to control and prevent disease emergence, how to safeguard associated industries, and how to protect our emotional and mental well-being. Responses to these questions have not brought any radical changes in our uses of animals, from wildlife and farm animals to those used as entertainment or for companionship. Rather, their use is to become more sustainable, responsible, ethical, and safer. The dominant message is that using animals in these and other ways is not in principle a problem. Contrary to the UN Secretary General's plea in July 2020 then, we have indeed returned to the systems that gave rise to the current crisis, or rather we never left them. The COVID story can therefore be read as itself a symptom of a much deeper malaise in our relationship with nature. Part of the problem, I suggest, is that there's so far been little conception of these industries and activities as part of a larger interconnected system of animal use. Once they're understood in this way, attention can perhaps shift from a narrow focus on issues within uses to issues underpinning the entire system. In critical animal studies, this system of animal use is referred to as the animal industrial complex. Richard Twine, co-director of our centre, describes this as a set of global networks and relationships between corporate sector, government, and public and private science. It operates at local, national, and global scales, encompassing an extensive range of practices, technologies, identities, and markets. Parts of it are hidden, others are more visible, but perhaps most of it is hidden in plain sight, so normalized as to be rendered invisible. To envisage the complex, it might help to think of the compound eye of an insect made up of thousands of hexagonal cells. Each cell depicts one part of the complex. The cells are connected economically, legislatively, politically, and also more literally in terms of movements of animals. For example, between the wildlife trade, the pet industry, and the zoo industry, or between the agricultural industry and research. There are also material connections. In each case, animals need to be captured, contained, controlled, separated, trained, moved, bred, and/or killed. The cages, fences, tethers, restraints, electric devices, tools, and techniques used to accomplish these are similar across all uses, while at the same time being indications of animals' resistance and non-compliance with these uses. Any activity involving animals can be located somewhere in the complex, comprising one part, however small, of the complete picture. That said, the crux of this structural story is the rationale or ideology that undergirds our uses of animals, that facilitates, legitimates, and sustains the animal-industrial complex. This rationale can be understood in different ways. Anthropocentrism is becoming widely used, and there's also human centrism, human supremacy, or human sovereignty, and closely related is speciesism. Scholar Fiona Probyn-Rapsey describes anthropocentrism as a way of being in the world that places humans not only at the center of everything, but as the most important measure of all things. Everything that is other than human can therefore be appropriated for our benefit, whether that benefit is economic, social, or emotional. Anthropocentrism emerges from and shapes a series of related binaries between humans and nature or animals, culture and nature, reason and emotion, male and female, civilized and primitive, white and black, and so on. Categories on the left are associated with the highest expression of mankind, superior to those on the right. Conflations within these categories have the effect of naturalizing the resulting hierarchies so that those deemed closer to nature are seen to be naturally inferior, lacking in reason, civilization, and ultimately value. This is how animalization works to further marginalize certain groups who are cast as lesser or subhuman, closer to animals. Critical race scholar Af Ko describes animality as the foundation of the racial system, part of a larger system of social branding of certain bodies. In turn, the humanization of certain animals based on sentience, complex emotions, intelligence, and other human measures can afford them some benefits and freedoms denied to dumber animals. Saving the environment, safeguarding health, or reducing animal suffering should therefore not be seen as the central arguments against animal-based industries and practices. The goals of critical animal scholars and of radical movements for animals, the environment, and social justice extend well beyond such utilitarian and potentially welfarist arguments, challenging deeply rooted and multidimensional logics of difference, hierarchy, and oppression. In terms of our relations with animals, this means critically reflecting on all our interactions with them, considering the extent to which we provide space for their consent or allow their social branding to legitimate our behaving in ways that limit their own expression. This is how our thinking can start to be undone. So amid fragmented and conceptually distanced discussions about factory farming and health, animal agriculture and climate change, the wildlife trade and biodiversity, the story of the animal industrial complex is rarely told, even within animal advocacy. The message is considered too complex, and advocacy organizations are advised to keep their communication simple. However, simple does not need to mean simplistic. And in the interests of all current and future life on Earth, we need to be presented with better explanations for why things are the way they are, why they need to change, and how this change might come about. And therein lies the promise and the danger of an untold story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula, and for sticking to time. We're going to move straight on to our next speaker now, Donnell.
Hello, thank you. And thank you firstly to Joe, Danny, and the team at ISR for putting on this event, and for everybody for coming along and being here as well. And thank you for that opening presentation, Paula. So the stories we tell. COVID-19 has a narrative. Perhaps it has had and continues to have many narratives depending on when, where, and how the stories are told and who is telling the story. Some COVID-19 narratives are more dominant than others. For example, there is presently much discussion about approaches and solutions to COVID-19 and future pandemics. Discussion about ensuring a situation like COVID-19 pandemic doesn't happen again This often includes the need for calls for like financial investment, technology for prevention, the importance of new disease surveillance, suppression, personal protective equipment, PPE, and systems like track and trace. And of course, these often involve discussions about the significance of vaccines in disease eradication. The dominant COVID-19 narrative has been the focus on One Health as a vital response and as a potential solution to the issues of zoonotic disease-causing pandemics. It lacks an operational definition of One Health, and its conceptualisation and its application are somewhat flexible, but in essence, it refers to the recognition that humans, other animals and the environment are intimately connected. It calls for the uniting of otherwise distinct organisations, institutions and disciplines to work together and for collaboration to occur across sectors. This means collaboration between those working in the realms of human health, non-human animal health and environmental health. While there are merits in a One Health approach and welcomed recognition of the interconnectedness of humans and other animals and the environment, One Health, at the same time as promoting connection, reinforces distinction between humans and other animals when, of course, humans are animals too. One Health problematically views humans as one group, as a species, while the millions of other animal species are grouped together as one, and this happens with the environment too. Non-human species, whether animals or plant or other, for example, rivers, are in fact individual dynamic entities, and when referred to collectively are de-individualised, which better enables their rendering as merely resources for human use. The stories we don't tell. Consequences of humanity viewing other animals and the vast elements of the environment primarily as resources for human use is not a very dominant COVID-19 narrative. The stories that haven't been told so much or nearly enough in mainstream media relate to the need to face reality in light of COVID-19 and critically evaluate our relationships to other animals and the ecological realm. And it's a shame because these are the stories that need to be told. They are the stories needed to prompt serious consideration as to how humans can live more harmoniously with non-human animals, not only to reduce the risk of zoonosis, but to improve consideration and treatment of other animals and the environment, and to mitigate climate change. Such stories could incite discussion through raising many equally important issues. For example, while there has been some discussion around the commodification and trade in animals we call wildlife since the emergence of COVID-19, and while shutting down exotic animal trade is crucial, a focus on wildlife trade alone may detract us from issues around and risks related to conventional food production, which under capitalism is profit-driven and centred on the consumption of animals. Moreover, the focus on wildlife trade and/or animal agriculture alone may detract us from the need for a fundamental shift in our thinking about human-animal relations. While initiatives such as One Health focus on how to reduce the risks of zoonotic pandemics within the animal agricultural industry, another approach that receives less mainstream attention is transition to a plant-based economy. Transforming our food system may pose some challenges, but that doesn't mean it couldn't or shouldn't be done. It would require attention to and support of industry transition and more investment in and support for plant-based alternatives to animal-derived products. But it's an important topic since the role that animal agriculture plays in the destruction of ecosystems, loss of wildlife habitat, and providing the conditions for zoonosis spillover is known. Dominant COVID-19 narratives often focus on humans' response to the threat that other animals pose and mitigation of risk. These stories ask how we can predict the next pandemic or prevent an outbreak or better protect human beings. Yet what is needed are more stories about the issue of proximity, or specifically the conditions of proximity between humans and other animals. The conditions of proximity cause pandemics. But not only discussions about the conditions of proximity, such as the factory farms, the feedlots, the laboratories, the live animal market, but the conditions that give rise to these sites of proximity. You might find useful here some of the concepts that Paula mentioned, anthropocentrism, speciesism, and I would add carnism. Blame for the COVID-19 catastrophe has been levelled at particular countries and cultures and non-human animal species. The role that humans play in the emergence of zoonosis is often missing from stories about COVID-19. Pandemics are a social as much as a biological phenomenon, and human behaviour, actions and beliefs yield particular outcomes. In addition to globalisation, urbanisation and human population growth and density, our tendency to live in megacities, zoonotic pandemics happen because of the way in which humans view and relate to the non-human constituents of nature. The confinement of non-human animals in proximity to each other and in proximity to humans, which creates the conditions for zoonoses, and the consumption of animals and animal byproducts should be dominant COVID-19 narratives, are framed in a critique of the cultural discourses that underpin non-human animal confinement and consumption. The beliefs that facilitate practices of non-human animal confinement and consumption are the topics of the stories we need to tell. COVID-19 should perhaps not be seen as a challenge to overcome a catastrophe that will eventually pass, but rather as a symptom and consequence of a deeply embedded problem with the ways humans think about and relate to non-human animals and the natural world. Words coronavirus and COVID have themselves spread like a linguistic pandemic, such that they went from being unknown a few years ago, at least to most non-medical people, to being encountered, spoken, heard or read, likely daily. These terms, however, can become detached from what they represent, zoonoses, and become detached even further from a root cause of zoonotic pandemics, humans' confinement and consumption of non-human animals, and are further detached from the mechanisms that legitimise humans' use and consumption of non-human beings. The property status and commodification of non-human animals is underpinned by a divide forged between humans and the rest of the animal kingdom, and indeed the natural world. And the legitimacy of this divide and its consequences is the story that should be at centre stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Donnell. We're going to move straight to Alex.
Thank you to the ISR and Edge Hill and everyone for coming, and to Paula and Donnell already for presenting really interesting papers. I sort of forgot about my own as I was listening to Donnell's there. And because there's just so many untold stories, the puppies and dogs who haven't been able to socialise because of the pandemic, or the animals who have been exploited in animal testing to lead to the vaccines, for example. And I remember the animals who were killed because they couldn't be sold when meat consumption dropped at the beginning of the pandemic. And I'm a writer and a journalist and an academic. I'm also an activist, and I wish in a way I'd been writing letters every day to all of these animals and the untold stories. But instead, just what I'm going to focus on, what has come to light for me in discussions with other activists and other people who have been considering these issues, was about in a way, the global or the story infrastructure and the communications ecosystem, as it were, that meant that the connections between the zoonotic sources of the current pandemic and animal agriculture and our encroachment into habitat, and as Donnell said, proximity, had moments where they arose and burst into sort of awareness, but then really didn't stick. So we know that most zoonotic pandemics have come from zoonotic sources, and there is a long history of that. We also know that animal agriculture, and particularly here, for example, the Centers of Disease Control in America identified the majority of novel influenza viruses coming from commercial poultry production systems. So it's not just the proximity from human animal to non-human animal, but obviously the enclosed stress spaces of proximity of animals in animal agriculture. We know as well that this is known and aware by those who have perhaps some influence and power, like the Eat Advisory Board, who are helping shape the United Nations Food Systems Summit agenda. And their quote, "Food is at the heart of the new global risk landscape, a macro critical risk to global stability every step of the way." We know these root causes. And there were moments when this did break through into public consciousness, particularly from like these excellent academics and their article in The Guardian from the beginning, talking about ending subsidies to industrial animal agriculture and taxing animal products. But it didn't really stick. And the conversations that I've been having with colleagues is about what we can do there. And in the short time I've got here, I really wanted to focus just in a way on the media ecosystem, on the story infrastructure, about what stories get told, which ones remain untold, and what we can do about that. So what follows really are 6 points that really have the questions in the points, really, about sort of what we need to think about. And again, this is just in a small area of this issue, rather than, you know, this isn't a blueprint of the answers for everything. You know, I certainly can't provide that. But number 1 is something that the animal groups in the UK have started to do. It was a suggestion to build an animal protection pandemic alliance, to use the leverage of the pandemic to bring people together, so that actually when we talk about an animal protection movement or an animal advocacy movement, it really is a movement where there is coordination and collaboration, not just around action, but around messaging as well. And that was done actually for better deals for animals in the recognition of animal sentience in the UK law post-Brexit. You know, organisations really did come together around that. Second was about anyone working to better the world for animals, human or non-human. We need responses ready to go. We need to be working on these, and we need them to be, you know, we need them there, because actually that is the way that fairly incompetent governments act within crises. They look around to see what's on hand. We need to be gathering evidence, and this is for the academics in the audience. Are you doing research, and are you gathering evidence that's going to be useful for the next opportunity when it comes to shift the Overton window, shift the story ecosystem, so that the stories of animals become front and centre? We know, you know, Carrie Freeman's done a lot of work around this. I've done work around this, about how the media particularly report upon animals. Yeah, it's very often punning, it's very often playful, it's very dismissive, you know, and we need to gather evidence that actually says, look, these are really serious issues for human and animal health, and the connections between them. And we need that evidence ready. We also need to be researching, writing and testing new stories, whether this be media messaging, creative stories, creative artistic interpretations, whatever it might be. You know, and we're not just talking to ourselves as those who care deeply about sort of animals and animal justice. It needs to be language smart messaging that's going to work for public audiences and politics and policymakers. Fifth, this is a really big one. This is a multi-million pound, multi-decade project, because that is what the political right wing and those who want to keep animals in their place have been doing since the first think tank was established in the late 40s and 50s, the Institute of Economic Ideas, from a battery chicken farmer who wanted to keep politics out of his battery chicken business. You know, those who are involved in wanting to shift the status quo about animals need to really be thinking big scale about how we build stories and tell stories, not just as message, but in terms of the infrastructure that's going to carry and amplify those messages. And just finally, we can't wait until the next pandemic arrives, because it's probably already here. We've already seen stories about a swine flu mutating into human virus over in Canada. So that's it from me. The EAT Advisory Board is saying this. A wonderful novel by Laura Jean Mackay about animals gaining speech through a virus pandemic outbreak is saying this. We need to bring all of that story together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex, and to all the speakers. Excellent sticking to time there. So I'm going to start with a question, and then we seem to be having quite a few in the chat now. What do you say, and I mean, I say this as devil's advocate, but what do you say, I think, go back to, I think it might have been Paula or Donnell talking about plant-based economy. If we remove animals from the food chain, do we not impact biodiversity, ironically? Who wants to go first, Paula?
Hi, Joe. Well, it's actually the introduction, well, the intensification of animal agriculture that is responsible for the massive collapse in biodiversity, quite simply. Yeah.
You're all going to agree with each other, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, it takes up about 80% of whatever agricultural land is in exists globally. So if we actually remove those animals from those areas and allowed them to rewild to an extent, to go to recover, to repair, then biodiversity would follow suit, hopefully, ideally.
Donnell?
I was going to say the same thing, so I don't have anything to add. You're right, I do agree with Paula on this occasion, and I'm wondering if Alex has anything to add.
No, there's not really much to add. It's pretty straightforward. Yeah, like it's the biggest threats to biodiversity on this planet is pretty much expansion of animal agriculture.
I think the four of us might understand that. I'm not sure that's a story that is widely understood outside of this. I always hear the if you stop farming animals then they become extinct argument. And so we have some work to do there. But rather than me carry on talking, let's go to some of the questions from the audience. So we've got a question from Mel, who is acknowledging that it is way out of her area, but I've heard people talk about COVID responses being either animal or people-centred. And I wondered what you thought about this. Does there have to be a dichotomy? Let's go to Alex first.
No, dichotomies and dualistic thinking are really very unhelpful in most areas, you know. So they're you know, like there's, you know, I'm sure people have seen, you know, those lovely graphics that that view the world differently, from egocentric, where the humans are at the top, to ecocentric, where humans are one of any number of species living on this planet. And actually, I think part of the job of telling stories, and this is what many stories do really well. So whether it be excellent journalism or film or video or documentary or novels or poetry, that actually not only question what, you know, where pandemics come from, or the injustices within sort of the way we use animals, but also through the language, through the form, through the storytelling, questions the dichotomy. And I think that's really important. So it's a really good question. I think it's very easy for obviously humans to fall into human-centered conversations and storytelling, and they will always unfortunately naturally be, because we tell them in our language, with our bodies, in our ways. And stepping outside of that that dichotomy, or that leads to hierarchy, is really very difficult, and it takes attention and care and compassion to undo the dichotomy and the dualism as we tell the story of others or with others. So I think it's a really important point, and it doesn't have to be that way, but within the hustle and bustle of very busy daily lives, I mean, that is how it's gone. But it also benefits the status quo for that dichotomy to be in place, because that dichotomy supports a hierarchy and we are in the position of power, and therefore it's really difficult to shift that hierarchy and that dichotomy.
Okay, Paula.
Yeah, I think there's not much to add in terms of COVID, but maybe stepping outside of COVID, I would just observe that usually, whether you're looking at animal or social equality, the two are usually not far behind each other, and usually very much entangled. So, you know, thinking of, just as one instance, the push to ban wet markets, not just in Asia, but in America, there was state bills being put forward in California and New York to ban local wet markets. And there was some critiques pointing out that this very much targets marginalized communities primarily, while the large meat processing plants that were viewed as essential services became the hotbeds of transmission. And usually, again, it's marginalized refugees, migrants, undocumented workers that work in them. So often the two are very much entangled when you're considering inequities for both animals and humans. And yeah, I think like Alex said, they need to be tackled together. Well, they're not separate anyway. Yeah.
You know.
Thanks. Yeah, I think Paula's point about intersectionality is very important. So the recognition of the enmeshment or the interlinking of marginalisation or oppression, non-human animals and certain groups of humans. I think that the dichotomy is altogether unhelpful. I think that this is a shared or collective issue, and that looking at, in any way, really now trying to think about how we separate humans from all the other animals in the animal kingdom, whether it's, as justification to use them, or whether it's just a way that a language works, should be identified and challenged, because I just think it's an unhelpful thing to be distinguishing those two, and problematic in so many ways. And then just to go outside again a little bit, as Paula did, in terms of COVID, is in studying animals in emergencies, which is something I've done previously. We found that people felt that it was inappropriate or insensitive to talk about the plight of non-human animals or non-human animal related issues when there was human suffering. And that in some way reflects anthropocentrism and the view that these issues are in a hierarchy, when they could. I don't know why they can't be seen as equally important, other than that we would privilege human suffering or human issues over non-human animal issues, when in actual fact they are interconnected and the same. So I think that in terms of how people might feel reluctant to talk about or listen to the non-human animal plight or issue in a situation like this can be made secondary to the human narrative and the human stories. So I thought that might be helpful in terms of my previous research in that area.
Do you not also think that sometimes that comes down to the type of animal? So I think people are interested in koala bears in bushfires because they're cute, although you may disagree, Donnell, you've got more experience with koala bears than me probably. But actually when we think about a bat and coronavirus, we don't think of bats in the same way. Do you think that also informs the way in which these stories are told, or how we perceive them?
I do. I think the categorization of animals within human society is something that underpins a lot of the ways in which some animals are less legally protected or are less culturally revered as opposed to others. And I think that links into what needs to be challenged in terms of the ways we think about these beings and ascribe these socio-cultural meanings and categorizations upon them. Some animals sit in multiple categories, or a rabbit is a good example of an animal that sits in multiple categories depending on where that rabbit is kept, whether it's a cherished, loved companion species, whether it's a experimental model in a laboratory, whether it's a feral pest. These labels can change from even within one species, but I do think that we tend to categorize the animals, and that makes us more open to maybe stories of disaster coming through if they relate to companion animals, if they're perceived in competition with human narratives, as opposed to, say, the suffering animals in laboratories, factory farms, or from groups of wildlife that have been demonized through being cast as a threat to humanity and as the root source of COVID and everything that we're going through, which obviously I don't ascribe to.
Okay, let's move on to a question from the audience, and one from Victoria. How hopeful are you that we will actually start to rewrite these stories? We had an opportunity, but is that moment already fading? Let's go to Paula first.
Yes, I think perhaps the moment has passed. The World Wildlife Fund, in their most recent report that just came out in September last year, asked that exact question, will this year have been a catalyst for really radical change? And sadly, I don't think it has been, but I think it has done a lot of revealing and disclosing to perhaps the people that are maybe a bit surprised that this didn't catalyze a bit more. So I think in terms of generating a greater passion to actually do the things that Alex has been sort of listing, I think it has done that, maybe shown people that are pushing for change that the job is a lot more serious now, perhaps.
Alex?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Victoria, because actually it's a really nice and succinct one that provides a hope, like leads me to want to provide a hopeful answer. And actually, I think my answer is yes, because of it in many really creative spaces as well, actually. So, you know, Laura Jim Mackay's book, The Animals in That Country, just won a major literary award in Australia. You've got excellent writers in the Afrofuturist world, sci-fi, led by Black women writers, doing incredible work in terms of rewriting species relations through science fiction, which is really inspiring a lot of people. And then you've got as well these techniques and strategies for making messaging more effective that animal rights groups and animal organisations around the world are starting to pick up and use to be more effective in their messaging. So, for example, there's a new organisation called Animal Ask, which is doing exactly that, working out how effective the messaging and the storytelling is. So for me, actually, yeah, there's a lot of hopefulness because I'm seeing more often more examples of people wanting to think we need to rewrite the story, and therefore the impetus is there to do so. So I think, yeah, I do have hope.
Okay, so now?
Not much to add to that. Yes, I am hopeful. I see change all the time. I recently read a wonderful piece of work by scholar Michelle Westerlaken, who talks about interactive design and the potential for not falling into the trap of feeling paralysed by thinking about what the opposite to what something that already exists is, but trying to look already around us for ways in which we are doing things differently. And we can see that all the time. Just one initiative I found the other day was this project called Transformation. They're assisting, it's like a farm-led movement for a food system, and is assisting farmers who want to get out of animal agriculture into moving into different forms of plant farming. I think these little things are out there at the moment. I guess our greatest challenge to bringing about some really meaningful, productive change is fragmentation. And I think, Paula, you've spoken about this a little bit as well. There's a lot of interesting things going on, and also this links into the first point you made, Alex, about, you know, having a kind of uniting momentum for bringing all the ideas together and making things seem possible, because I think that they can seem daunting or not possible when there's fragmentation. Having a whole lot of great ideas that are positive and can represent the possibility for real change, so that this doesn't happen again and we don't have to go through this again, and that maybe we can bring about a future that a lot of people would potentially be interested in, is possible, is a way forward. We'll see.
Okay, so there's a very long question in the chat, so I'm going to shrink it down to the last couple of sentences. It basically says, rather than a narrative that COVID has been a bad thing for animals, that actually has exacerbated narratives around poverty and hunger, and that livestock and eating animals is actually good for nutrition and therefore may end up having the opposite effect. Do you have any views? Let's start with Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Abby. Yeah, I'm not. I can see a lot of your ideas and research in this, and I think you're absolutely right. I think for me, so I've got a big piece of work I've been working on for the last 18 months, which has taken up way too much of my time. But I'm glad I've done it. Is we're working with a vegan society around food, the policy we need for a plant-based food system, and actually, and I'm not telling tales out of school here, but there is a lot of there's resistance even within the vegan movement, animal justice activists, to a future with animals in it. in our rural countryside or landscape. If animals have to be transitioned out of animal agriculture into places where they're free living, stewarded, cared for, protected, they'll still be pooping. You know, they'll still be providing sort of fertilization for the ground. How is there a possible way that they can do that and benefit our food system without being controlled, without being owned, without being considered property? And I think that story, you know, like, it isn't in our imagination yet. We haven't thought about it. We haven't thought that it's possible. So my sense is that, yeah, you're absolutely right. There are big global dominant narratives. Maybe COVID isn't the key that's going to unlock them, to transform them. I think what we need to do is be constantly envisioning new ideas, new narratives, and building the infrastructure around them that can amplify them and test them and share them, so that we're not only challenging the stories, we're challenging the infrastructure that makes them dominant.
Okay, I lost a tiny bit of that because I froze, but I'm back now, so that's okay. Donnell, do you want to add to that?
Thank you. I don't have anything to add to that. I think that was so yeah, if Paula has anything to add.
Maybe just one thing, building on it, I would say that recognition of the, I guess, the behemoth, the sense that there's this massive, essentially industrial complex that acts as a barrier to dispersed and integrate and other efforts to push through it. I think it makes it even more important that we have a really coherent and strong counter narrative, because at the moment I don't think it's strong enough to push through that, and I think it's also compounded by some perception problems in the animal movement. I don't think the general public has the same perception of the animal movement as perhaps those within the movement currently do, because it's gone through quite a lot of evolution since sort of the 60s and 70s, and its association with animal rights and certain things. I think it's moved on a lot from that, but I don't think that perception is out there. I think it's mired in a little bit of like conflation with, of course, recently with terrorism, with sort of negative connotations with the movement. And so I think that makes it even more important that that it does build a strong, coherent counter-narrative to these big industry arguments and in financial interests that can be really powerful, legislative interests. I mean, there's actions happening all over the world against these things, but I think as Alex has been talking about, the narrative, there's something missing there at the moment, I think.
Okay, well, we still have a few minutes. If anybody would like to ask a question, either in person or on the chat, please do. Otherwise, you will have to have me asking another question, which you may not want as a non-specialist. Okay, well, I'm going to ask a question then. I have some deep concern about pets that people got in lockdown and what is going to happen to them when everybody goes back to the office. I know my dog has loved lockdown, haven't they all? Because I've been around all the time. But I don't see any counter narrative to why this may or may not have been a good idea, and I don't see any preparation or people talking about, you know, a dog's for life, it's not just for lockdown, any of that. There's no narratives around that at all. I don't know what the panel think about that. And actually we have another question which you might want to conflate. So we have a question from Gabriella. Most of the world seems to be ignoring swine flu and avian flu, and how do we create narratives around that? So I give you a choice, my question or Gabriella's, probably Gabriella's. Let's start with Donnell.
As a veterinary nurse, I'll answer your question, actually, Jo. So I just was playing around on the internet last week, just doing a very miniature project of the much larger, fantastic project that Paula did in looking at COVID-19 narratives in mainstream media. And so I did my own little, game, I guess, where every day I looked to see what sort of stories were out there. And I did actually come across just a couple about these pandemic puppies and warnings from advocacy agencies or organisations like RSPCA and like. I don't know exactly if it was them or who it was, but certainly some concern about what is going to happen with those companion species that people had when they were in lockdown. I think I'm going to bring up this term separation anxiety. I think that's something that humans don't consider enough when getting animals as companions anyway, particularly with species like dogs who are very social and who normally live among others. It's very stressful for them to be separated from their human families if they don't have any company. And that goes for an 8-hour day sometimes, let alone being so dramatically left after people go back to work after a long period of being at home. I think that there is probably likely going to be a huge increase in dogs being presented for separation anxiety post-COVID when the lockdown lifts, if it ever lifts. I know it feels like at the moment it's an if. And I think that that's a crisis. I think that's a terrible thing. I think it will result in a lot of dogs being medicated. I think that that's a story that needs to be told again every day, not just when a pandemic happens, that the conditions in which we keep companion species are sometimes not adequate or suitable for the kind of animal that they are socially, if they are a single, it's kept as a single pet. And so that's a story that needs to be told more, that putting companion species in some situations can lead them to suffer psychologically. And yeah, I mean, I don't see any way now of averting that crisis when it comes. I just hope that, maybe regulation needs to happen in the future too. I mean, I ideally would like to see puppies not being able to be impulse purchased. I think it's something that needs to be thought through more by people rather than just doing that in an instant or a moment without thinking of the long-term consequences of that. So I see that as an utter tragedy. There are a few stories coming through, but nowhere near enough, and we don't talk about the conditions in which we keep companion species outside of pandemic times, and that's a story that needs to be told as well.
Thanks, Donnell. Your passion for that is evident. Paula, up to you. Which question you answer?
I would just add to what Donnell was saying and say that I think the problem with facing the COVID puppies is a symptom of course, a deeper problem with our commodification of pets and animals in general that we feel entitled to buy as entertainment, as another emotional being to have in our house. And of course we all love our pets, but I think we need to question the knock-on effects financially, economically, that has, even though the wildlife trade originates mostly in Asia, it's America and Europe that are the top importers for pets. So the COVID puppy situation is just really a natural outcome. It was an inevitable outcome in a way of this commodification of attributes that we desire, which are companionship and distraction and entertainment. And yeah, I think that's something we need to think about.
Okay, my question seems to have ignited the chat as well. Alex, up to you. Puppies or swine flu?
Yeah, I'll reply to Gabriella to make sure she gets replied to. I think, Gabriella, I think that, well, to begin with, the clue is in the name there, isn't there, a little bit, because people call it or think of it as swine flu, as avian flu. They are very much labels that represent our incredible ability to separate ourselves off from the non-human animal world. And they are representative of the very speciesist social structural relations that we have with other animals. You know, like chickens and pigs are hidden away within the animal agriculture system. The majority of both of those animal species never see the outdoors. The majority of their, you know, the billion lives on the planet. And anything that makes our current life uncomfortable in terms of having to change is something that we have built structures around us very effectively to keep away from us, because we are comfortable with our hierarchy and being the dominant species on the planet and having our comforts. So everything, and a really good example of that is when a new avian flu epidemic or incident or crisis emerges, the majority story that you hear in the media is that it's spread by wild geese, you know, crossing borders. It's nothing to do with the poultry industry, even though the Centres for Disease Control finds all of the evidence within poultry production. It's because it challenges the status quo, and we do everything we can to label it and separate it. And unfortunately, that's why that is the case, according to me.
Thanks, Alex. Right, well, we're moving to the end of the hour now, so I'm going to give you each 2 minutes just to sum up your thoughts. So let's start with Paula.
Oh, I was just going to, can I ask Alex something on the back of that? That just, do you think it's also because mostly swine flu and avian flu have affected non-Western places mostly?
But perhaps, I mean, MERS, you know, MERS and SARS were obviously affected sort of some areas of North America, some areas, many areas of Asia. I think the big thing about the coronavirus is that it's finally affected the West, you know, the Western democracies, and suddenly we've sat up to pay attention. And so maybe if there was a big swine flu or avian flu epidemic, that, and again, I don't really like those labels, obviously, but within quick memory of the coronavirus pandemic, maybe we will respond to it differently now. Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Donnell, do you have a last word?
Just a last word in summary, just to thank you again for, I guess, giving a platform to the untold stories of COVID-19 and for allowing us to speak about the non-human animal stories, and that I also mean by the environment as well. I think sometimes in talking about these issues, it's also important to, you know, we're talking about aspects of the environment as well, not just human, non-human animal issues. And yeah, I mean, for me, I guess it comes down to as well the importance of speaking about things that make us uncomfortable. And I guess a lot of the reasons that maybe some stories aren't told is because of the discomfort that's associated with thinking about some of the issues that we've talked about here, of which there are many more as well. And just the importance, I think, of thinking about how humans may have contributed or created the conditions for this pandemic, what underlies, what sort of beliefs, socio-cultural beliefs we perpetuate or that we support that have enabled situations that have brought this to fruition. Again, uncomfortable, but I just feel like it's some of the uncomfortable stuff is where we need to be, stick with the discomfort here. And thinking a little bit more, I guess, about the ways in which, if you see and look in society, language reinforces this distinction between humans and other species in the environment, the ways in which language might privilege humans and human perspectives. I think that the work that's being done in terms of changing laws is very important, and also within politics, there's, you know, much more that needs to be done. But think of ways in which, you know, we can exercise agency in that way, if this is something that matters to you. But yeah, most of all, I think is focusing on some of those beliefs. And if you hadn't come across them before, I think maybe just becoming familiar with some of them. So we mentioned anthropocentrism, speciesism, and just reflecting on that and seeing what you think and how you feel about it as an individual. Thank you.
Thanks, Donnell. I don't think we could sum it up any better. So it just leaves me to thank our three speakers, Paula, Donnell and Alex. It's been really insightful and very uncomfortable. I was terrified about what you were going to say because I just hate these stories to do with animals as much as I know I need to know them, but I just don't want to think about them being mistreated at all. as I said at the beginning, this is part of our Festival of Ideas, and we have 2 more events. One tomorrow night looking at advances in primary care, and that's being put on by the Health Research Institute. And on Friday night, Data Science Research Centre are convening a public lecture on whether or not we can turn this disaster into opportunity in terms of sustainability in the environment. So I really encourage you to sign up and join us for those. The events are in the chat, and how you can do so is linked there. Also, if you've got any comments you want to make about this evening or any feedback, please put them on our festival wall, and the QR code is also in the chat. What would normally happen in these circumstances is that we would now all retire for some wine and nibbles, but sadly we can't do that. So I'm going to invite you all to go to your own fridge and get a glass of wine and some nibbles out, and to have a think about some of the things we've talked about this evening, and particularly our speakers. Please go and have a little toast to yourself. Thank you so much, and have a good evening, everybody.